Okay, so today we're going to be talking about reverb and how to use reverb in your mix. If you're struggling to create depth at all in your mix, then stick around for this video and I show you exactly my process to use a 4-stage reverb technique in order to create depth and dynamic with reverb. Also, if you haven't already, there's an EQ and compression guide that you can pick up for free right below this video. The first link should be that link to the EQ and compression guide. You can pick that up for free to help you in your journey of getting professional mixes. So today we're gonna be talking about one of my favorite topics, reverb. Reverb is my secret weapon to creating depth inside of your mix. And this is fairly obvious, right? Reverb creates depth. However, there's a specific technique that I like to use to enhance the depth of the mix without actually creating reverb sounds. And that might seem really weird, but there's this awesome technique that I learned how to create basically a 3-stage reverb setup to create depth without actually hearing the reverb so much. Let's dive into exactly how this is done. So my mix here, I'm probably 80% of the way there in terms of actually dialing in my EQ and my compression. So it's mostly the way there in terms of just the 80% of what I want. Our mix is still relatively flat in terms of there's very little depth that we've created so far inside of our mix. Well, we can create some depth with EQ changes and some compression changes. Really, overall, it hasn't done too much. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up a series of buses. We're going to send every single one of our instrument buses through. The first one we're going to be adding here. So I'm going to be adding all these buses. So what I'm doing is I'm routing I've created 4 buses that are over here, they're just blank. And then I'm gonna route those 4 buses back into my mix bus. So then all of the reverb that we're gonna create is gonna go back into the mix bus and go through the normal mix bus processing. And then I'm gonna label these, I'm gonna label one the front, one the middle, another one the back, and then the last one the room. We'll get to the room in a bit. We're gonna be focusing on the first 3 right now, because this is where all our depth is gonna be created. And the first step to do is just add a reverb plugin to it. Before I really use this at all, I'm going to listen to the mix and kind of think about what space would I think this song should belong in real life, right? So is it gonna be a big, massive church hall? Is it gonna be a small club? Is it gonna be an empty studio, etc.? So just think about what kind of space I want this song to sound like it's in and what's going to create the best energy for the song. Okay, so what I'm kind of feeling is a live-ish venue. There's some people there, so it's not gonna be super open and airy, but it's gonna be fairly dense. In order to do this, what we're gonna do is open up our reverb. I'm gonna send every single instrument through this first reverb. It's not gonna stay this way. This is just to set up our reverb initially. And I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna just start using presets to find out which one I like the most. I'm thinking it's probably gonna be in rooms or spaces here. Yeah, probably rooms. Because I want something, I don't want a hall, because halls are usually pretty big in terms of just like a cathedral or something like that you can think of for a hall, but rooms are generally going to include studios or smaller venues, something like that. And that's kind of what I'm feeling for this particular song. I'm just gonna start picking these and we're gonna figure out what preset sounds pretty good and then we'll tweak it from there. Let's just start with this big room here.
so I'm really feeling this one, but I also feel like it's a little bit small. So let's just start tweaking it from here. I think I'm gonna bring the size up, and then our decays, we're gonna time that. Let's start with the size. The density sounds pretty good to me. So density is going to be how many objects are inside of the room. So a venue with lots of people is going to be a very dense venue because there's lots of surfaces for the sound to bounce off of. It essentially creates more sound waves, not necessarily louder, but they're going to be smaller, but there's going to be more of them. So you get more of that wash sound rather than individual delay hits. So if you turn the density all the way down and you're listening to the snare, generally you can actually hear those individual reflections off the walls. So that's what density is. I think it sounds good for this particular case and song. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my decay. Generally, I have this pretty short for this type of reverb. Again, because I'm not really going to try to hear the sound of this room, but it's going to set the stage of how big the space is and also the depth of each element inside of the mix. Usually, yeah, between a quarter, an eighth and a quarter. I'm not sure exactly what I want, probably a quarter here. Kind of want some of that longer decay on this reverb, just because there's a pretty strong quarter note drive on this song, so I don't want it to go longer than that because that's going to just create a lot of mud and noise in the mix. But the quarter note is kind of nice because it'll allow that reverb to extend out to the next hit, or next major hit. This is just setting up the reverb again, just generally. So now we're at the stage where we can actually set up our stage. So we have a front, middle, and a back space to send different elements inside of our mix. So the front space is going to be the one that's closest to us. So there's a couple of things that we're going to do. The pre-delay, we're going to make that longer. So pre-delay is the difference between the direct sound and then the first reflection that's going to hit you. Pre-delay is generally the closest the object is, the longer the pre-delay will be. General rule of thumb is a pre-delay is between 25 and 50 milliseconds. When it gets out to about 50 milliseconds, you can audibly hear the difference between the direct sound and that first reflection. We don't necessarily want that. You can create some cool effects with it if you want, but just in natural spaces, you generally don't hear that separation. We're going to bump this up to about 35, pretty much the extent of what I would do, but because we're in this reasonably sized room, I feel like that's okay to do. Okay, so now that we've got a pre-delay, now we're moving on to distance. I'm gonna move that down to about 10%, so that's gonna be really close to us. And then the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dive into the details. And I'm not gonna touch the modulation stuff. I like the sound of the reverb overall, so I'm not gonna necessarily need to touch that. And then the one thing I'm really concerned about is the early and late reflections. If I do it 100% late, that means that I'm not going to hear any of the spatial information, and so I'm not going to be able to detect where that is. I'm just going to hear the tail of the reverb, which is the actual wash sound that you hear. So I'm going to move that early reflection up to about 95% or so. So because if you move it all the way to 100, sometimes it'll sound a little unnatural, so we don't want that, but it's going to be almost entirely early reflections and very little late reflections. This will also make the object feel really, really close to us. In addition to this distance, this also affects that balance. This is just a secondary measure. Those two together, though, is going to make everything sound really, really close to us. Remember, every single one of our elements right now is going through this reverb, and so it's going to sound really, really close, which is a little bit odd. But just stick with me, and we'll make this a little bit better here. But let's just listen to this really quick, and then it's going to sound odd, for sure. But just, again, stick with me, and we'll see where we're headed with this. That's the front reverb. So you can kind of tell everything kind of feels kind of close. It definitely sounds further away than when it's dry, but this is also very extreme. We're not going to have it this loud in the end. The next stage is to copy our reverb plugin over to the middle phase. And the only thing we're going to adjust is the distance parameters. The first thing is going to be the pre-delay. We're going to move that down to, let's say, 22. It doesn't matter so much as long as it's in between the farthest and the closest. So yeah, let's just say 20. And then the distance, I'm going to move up to about 50%. And then the last thing I'm going to adjust is the early versus late. The farthest back reverb that I'm going to have in my system is going to be 50-50 or around there. And so I want to split the difference between that. Let's just say 75-25. That's probably pretty good. And the reason I use the same exact reverb plugin and the same exact room settings is because I want all of these elements to feel like they're in the same mix, so it's or same space, so it's going to feel very, very cohesive and provide some glue, some natural glue inside of the mix. However, I'm still going to be able to create that depth and separation between different elements because some are going to feel really close and some are going to feel really far away. Let's set up our last one here. Pre-delay, I'm going to move it down to basically nothing. Distance almost all the way up, and then the early to late reflections, about 50-50. I might adjust this a little bit later too after I've been able to send items there and listen to it, but generally those are kind of the guidelines. I'm not going to adjust it too much from there. And then the last one is actually going to be our room reverb, and this will come into play a little bit later, but I'm going to move that back to 50% distance and all late reflections. So what this is going to do is, because the early reflections give us information on the space, how far things are away, what kind of room it is, etc. The late reflections just gives us that nice tail, that kind of wash that you hear. So it's kind of the effect version of the reverb. By doing this, I can send any item to this particular channel, this particular bus, and I'm going to be able to get the nice wash, but I'm not going to impact how close that element is to the listener. So I can send any item there and get the nice reverb effect without actually impacting the distance it is from the listener. The first three are the most important here. That's just kind of a little bonus effect if I want to actually hear more reverb on a particular element. So now that we have all of our elements going to the first bus, I'm going to now turn that off. Okay, so now I've reset everything back to 0, and I'm going to pick and choose which elements I want to be in the front of the mix versus the middle or versus the back. My general rule of thumb is I want 3 to 4 elements in the front of the mix, most of the elements in the middle of the mix, and then 2 to 3 in the back of the mix. So I can really emphasize the main elements and then just create more depth by sending just a few items in the back. The reason I don't send very many in the back is because the back of the mix takes up a lot more reverb space, and so I don't want to muddy up the mix too much by sending too many items back there. The other thing I'm going to do is, specifically with my drum bus, I'm going to send those to different buses in terms of the reverb. So I'm going to add these additional ones here. I just know from before I even listen to anything, I'm just going to start sending items back to the reverb I think they should belong to. So for example, my kick, I want that to be in the front of the mix, so I'm going to move that up to 0. My snare is going to be in the front, snare is going to be in the front, claps, let's move that to the middle. Toms are also going to be in the middle. My tambourine, let's move that to the middle. My cowbell is also going to be in the middle, and my crash is going to be in the middle. Let's move on to our bass. Our bass, I'm also going to move into the middle of the mix. It's going to be in the middle, going to be in the middle. Most of these items are going to be in the middle. I like them there. Mandolin rhythm to the middle. This is my acoustic and my band to the back. Lead elements here that want to create a little bit more separation for those. I'm going to send them to the back of the mix. See how it goes. I don't know. My lead guitar, I'm also going to send to the back. It's just providing a lot of texture, and it's not really a main element of this mix. Horns, we're going to send to the middle. Lead vocal, obviously going to be in the front, and then my backing vocals and my harmony vocals I'm going to send to the very back. So now we have our whole system set up. When I hit play here, it's going to sound like a lot of reverb, and that's because it is. We're not going to mix these to 0 like this, but just for the sake of being able to hear what I actually just did, I'm going to play it and let you listen to it. Just as a refresher here, we have our 3 stages here. So this is going to be the front, middle, and back. And we send each one 100% of the signal to each of those buses. So let's listen to it really quick. Then we'll fine tune it from there. So if we listen to, say, our lead guitar versus our vocal, you can tell that there's a lot more separation now. We're going to emphasize that even more by adjusting the volume here of these various buses. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring all of these down to 0 and bring up the first one until I can hear it, and then I'm gonna back it off a little bit, because these reverbs, I don't really want to be able to hear them. I just want them to create some space inside of the mix. Here is the front reverb.
Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is.
Okay, so now you can tell there's a little bit of reverb on there. For the sake of hearing what we've done so far, here's a quick A/B.
Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime. Coming back tonight, reaching towards the light. Your love is like springtime.
So you can't really hear most of the reverb except for probably on those back items, such as the harmonies. You can kind of hear the reverb coming through on those. But again, it's pretty subtle in terms of you wouldn't really be able to point out, oh, there's a ton of reverb in this mix. But that is very intentional because we want to be able to create some depth and some space inside of our mix without actually having to create a whole bunch of extra sonic information. That is my system for creating depth inside of the mix using just 3 reverb plugins. We're going to continue on to develop this in the coming videos, so make sure that you like and subscribe on this video. Also turn on the notifications to ensure that you are going to receive notifications for the coming videos, because we're going to be diving into effects here pretty soon. Please be intentional about creating some depth inside of your mix, because it's the #1 thing that I see amateurs not doing inside of their mix, and it really ends up ruining the song for you. So experiment with this system, change it to what you would like to do inside of your own mixes, but use some form of this and just test it out and see how your mixes sound after you actually add this in. That being said, thanks for watching and have a fantastic day.